How you doing?
Pretty well. How are you?
Pretty good. Everybody, this is David Ochabski. The C is silent. I learned that. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Wow. So I wear a lot of hats. First, I would say I'm a husband and father to Brittany and my daughter Lila. She's 2. And then I would say next I'm a student and teaching assistant at Liberty University. So I help with the School of Divinity, and I generally help with apologetics related classes and theology related classes. But my area of study is philosophical apologetics. So after that, I also work with Ratio Christi. So you can see the little logo here. So I can represent.
Yeah, I've seen Ratio Christi around quite a bit. Is it like a ministry or an apologetics course or?
Yeah, so it's a parachurch ministry. So we partner with churches and things like that, but mostly we're kind of like Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ, except we're more apologetics oriented. So we have chapters at universities. We believe that we can make the most impact at the university because it is the intellectual center in which everything else is disseminated. And so we mainly focus on apologetic evangelism, and that's our main. We have some side projects and things that we do, but I would say that's the main thing. And we have chapters nationally, internationally. I oversee Virginia, where I live, Maryland, and Delaware. So I'm an area ministry director, and then I also help with national training. And within national training, I help with chapter development and mostly apologetics training, internal apologetics training. So
sweet. So how did you get into apologetics? Have you always been a believer or?
No. So I was, I don't know. I've had it's been a roller coaster in my life with just trying to find meaning and things like that. So originally, I don't know how far back I should go, but I think I'll just skip to the to the conversion part. It mainly had to do with emotional and intellectual problems I was having at the time, and there was obviously, looking back on it, you can see 2020. As you're going through it, you're just trying to understand and grasp at straws and things like that. But looking back on it, it was clearly I had some emotional issues that I had to deal with. And there was, questions of like, how can God be a father to the fatherless? And I'm fatherless. And so how is God a father to me? I don't really know what that looks like. And then, questions of hell and eternal punishment and things like that. Those were some issues that I had to deal with emotionally first. And when my mom would take me to church all the time, and she was she was not the best person, I would say, to try to convert somebody, but I wasn't really convinced because of anything she really ever said, but she did bring me to church, and she did allow the Holy Spirit to work, and eventually, as I look back, I can say, wow, okay, whenever I had a question, I seemed to find the right answer and things like that. And I had to deal with some emotional things, but it was really the intellectual barrier that was like, okay, I can see this as like maybe coherent and consistent, and maybe this, just like any mathematical structure, is coherent and consistent. You can craft a fictional world, but is it true? Does it correspond to reality? I had to answer those questions of does this actually accommodate the data that we see in science and philosophy and things like that? So those are the things that I had to wrestle through, and then after I found that there's enough evidence that is convicting to me, I can actually make a decision now. So apologetics was that kind of medium and avenue that like I was finding answers through, even though I didn't know it was called that at the time. So
Yeah, kind of a similar story. It was, uh, people, anybody that's watching here that's watching any amount of time knows, I kind of had went to a legalistic church growing up and hit the streets and really wasn't interested in God. I'd tell people I was a Christian or believed in God, but, you know, didn't really believe it or really think about it much. And in my mid 20s, kind of had a crisis of faith. It was a moment that it's unexplainable. I was working in a field on my background is HVAC, and I was working on a cell tower in the middle of a pasture. And while working on the cell tower, I was sitting there thinking, this was before cell phones. So we had, well, there were cell phones, but the
right.
company didn't have them. We're a small contractor and they're just too expensive at times. So
Okay.
two-way radios. And I was like, man, if something happened to me, I would die all alone out here and nobody would even know it. I could be here for hours before somebody knew. And then it just, kind of just out of nowhere, these wheels just turning, is God real?
Mm.
Is there a heaven or hell? Am I going to heaven or hell? And it kind of just set me on this path that I had to know. And, with the fundamentalist and real legalistic background, from what little I did have exposure, I was young earth creationist. I was, about as literalist and legalistic as it gets. And so I was, faced all these different challenges. I hadn't even talked about this on here before, but I actually started talking about religion on the internet when there was only AOL. And
Oh, wow.
yes, and I
You were,
will,
those old, you were one of those old guys that I was
yeah,
13 and I was like, I'm gonna just mess with these guys and they're gonna get all mad because they're just old guys and they're trying to be proper and they don't know how to do internet culture yet.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you something interesting. Kind of a side note. I'm a little ADD, so sometimes I might kind of go off on a tangent. But uh, I ran into this religious AOL chat room, and I found Islam, and I didn't know really much about Islam. And they were some of the sweetest, most intelligent men in there that I had ever met in my life. I was stunned. I had some of the best conversations. So I really started to kind of, doubt Christianity.
Mhm.
And I kind of did like a Cartesian, doubting. I was like, wait a minute, why do I accept Christianity just because I was told, that Christ is God, the Son of God? And so it started with denominations, and then I went through, every major religion in the world. I mean, hard studying. And I was thoroughly convinced by the evidence for Christ. I was stunned that, it was a foregone fact and conclusion that Christ was a real man that walked and talked.
Yeah.
And when I really understood that, I was like, wow, he's not like this Santa Claus, this mythical person that, we accept by faith and things like that. And so I kind of got into the intellectual side of Christianity and stumbled in years later into Reason and Religion on Facebook and met all you guys, and it's been fun ever since. But so kind of the similar thing. It started out as kind of apologetics, but I'm far more interested in philosophy of religion than
Right.
um, actual apologetics. I mean, nothing against apologetics. I just,
Yeah.
you know,
Same with me, and I see how it's manifested in different ways, and when you're focused just on apologetics, like you are short-sighted in various things, and so I totally that's why I'm way more interested in philosophical apologetics as well. But yes, it was so mind blowing to me to start to study other religions. I mean, I started to study when I was a teenager and stuff because I was basically a spiritualist and I was interested in, things like that. And I didn't know what was true and I was trying to figure it out. And, but I was really a lot more interested in, wow, this thing is so abstract and so ambiguous and enigmatic, and like a painting, it's just like so enthralling, and there must be tons of meaning to it, all these gurus and things. And then I would be like, wait a minute, they don't seem to actually know what they're talking about. And anybody could just make a splash painting and say there's so much depth to it, and everything like that. And when I came across that same realization of like, wow, Christianity actually, stakes itself and says this is a historical claim, and this is something that we can investigate with the tools of historical science. And if if it's shown that this is not feasible, or we have extremely poor documentation, then it's not true. And that doesn't happen for other world religions. And it's pretty incredible. I currently help at Liberty University with the world religions classes. And I mean, it's just, it's not even part of their thought process to like, in Hinduism, we have a cyclical universe. In Buddhism, we don't care who said it. If Buddha really existed, he's so real in the innermost of your conscience that, of your consciousness, that it doesn't matter if we show this to be historical or not. That's not the case with Christianity. And then even with Islam, you can talk about Muhammad and you can say he's a historical figure and things like that. But then they make claims about the New Testament, and you have documentation that precedes Muhammad. And, so, like, clearly you're, working with much higher quality data when you're talking about Christianity and dealing with, is the New Testament corrupted and things like that. So it is pretty incredible. And that was I've not really cared so much about historical apologetics until I entered into the PhD program at Liberty, and I got to meet. Well, I'd been working with Dr. Habermas before with Ratio Christi and things like that, but actually studying under him, I've cared a lot more about historical apologetics and how you can use philosophy of religion and philosophy of science to determine, are miracles possible, and how can we determine whether an event took place, what are the criteria that we can use to judge if something is historically accurate, and things like that. And I found it to be incredible. It's just completely opened my eyes to like the quality landscape of the Old and New Testament, and it's just amazing, like how much you can really do with that. And like I said, I didn't really care so much about it before, but as I looked to the depth of it, it just seems so thick with good information and high quality data. So
yeah, that's kind of the realization I came to. I love Habermas. I've probably read almost everything that he's done, at least part of it. With the ADD, if it's not on audio book, it's hard for me to get through. I'd rather listen to it 2 or 3 times than read it once. So
yeah,
but yeah, that was my finding. I started with Hinduism, and with Hinduism, it was there was so much mythology and mysticism, and depending on where in India that you're looking at the historical narrative for Hinduism and things like that, it was just all over the place. To me, it just didn't correlate with reality the way that I knew and understand it. So I wasn't even remotely drawn to Hinduism.
that was the same with me. I just it seemed to me, because it's an open canon, that's a game changer.
Right.
It doesn't, like, you can clearly choose whatever God. You can bring Jesus into the picture, and they'll just be like, yeah,
Sure, yeah,
Jesus,
yeah,
just another God.
that's
And,
right.
and they were just there was so many contradictory propositional claims, and an infinite number of them, that you couldn't really pin
Real
it down anywhere.
contradictions.
Yeah, and so it's just and because it's part of the belief system, so I can't knock it for that. But
Right.
at the same time, it's not as falsifiable, and it's not as, you can't test it as easily, and you can't have as much confidence in it because of that. So yeah.
Yeah, and then went on to Buddhism, which I thought that it was a bit enticing to begin with, and then Basically, I realized it was like a radical type of idealism. It was, the everything that you experience is basically a lie. It's just this level of consciousness, and I'm just like, what? And then I think the first writings weren't even till like 1,000 years after Buddha. And I'm like, how well was this passed on? And did he really teach these things? And, so I was left with way more questions than answers with Buddha.
Mhm.
It was the deeper I dove into it, the more convoluted it seemed to be. And so then I went to Islam, and I was shocked when I realized that Islam was like 600 years after Christ.
Mhm.
And when I started reading about Muhammad, and he didn't even know he was a prophet, his uncle had to tell him he was a prophet. And then the visions that he had was insane. And, the life of Muhammad. And they consider any scripture, whether it's Jewish, Christian, if it corresponds with Islam, then it's considered holy scripture. But if it gets out of line or disagrees with, Islam or the Quran, then it's corrupted. And then I started reading about, these theories that Christ really was on the cross, but he was changed out at the last minute and really didn't die. And then all these, and I'm just like, what? Why
Right.
would we take something that has this open and closed narrative, and then 600 years later, this guy has these crazy visions, and for all for lack of a better word, lived a pretty evil life. He was a pretty crude guy.
Right.
So it left me with Christianity and Judaism. And
Mm.
the more that I learned about Christ, and I'm not sure how much you are into, typology or typology, but looking at the similarities between the types and the antitype from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it's just mind-boggling. These different types of what types, but the types in the Old Testament, just the cohesiveness, the synergy of it, the history that was there. And like you said, so much that could have been falsified, at the time of Christ, or times before that. So, and what really got me was I was mesmerized by the teachings of Christ.
Mm.
It was he was. I think anyone, even if they're not a Christian, should read the words of Christ for, at least its philosophical and ethical um, content, because to me he was probably the greatest philosopher in history. So yeah, that's without going 100 miles into it, that's kind of how I settled on it too. So it's
That's awesome. That's interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's looking at the uh being a skeptic by nature, because I'm a skeptic. I'm the miracles were so hard for me to understand, and things of that nature. So, but when you put it in perspective, it's like, if God created the universe, how hard is feeding 5,000 people? How hard is
Yeah.
healing people? I mean, that's a drop in the bucket to creating the universe. So
Right. And there's miracles that people get hung up on. Like I know John Loftus, and which I actually we've debated like in class. We had a class with Dr. Habermas where he was a guest, and we debated pretty good. And but I mean, we love each other, and he's very hung up on this the problem of like the virgin birth and how incredible it is, and all of that. And there's obviously uh the 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 Bible is entity laden with things that are unfalsifiable. And I'll never say that those things are testable. Like there's people say there's demonic activity, and that maybe that might be able to be measured at some point, but I haven't seen that myself personally, and I haven't measured it myself personally or anything like that. And the virgin birth is something I can't go back in history and like,
yeah,
oh, did she conceive, and can I get samples before and after? No, I can't do that. So yeah, there's things that are unverifiable. And but that's not the central claim. The central claim is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And if
Right.
Jesus rose from the dead, then God, he put his stamp of approval on Jesus' teachings, and what he said was with authority, and you can retroactively say, okay, the rest of those things are true because of this. And the probability of that is set on the bound of what's, how probable did Jesus actually rise again. But like, you can work backward from that. So there's people who get hung up on miracles and things like that. And I'm like, well, just test the verifiable ones, like, you don't have to go into, you don't have to like go into Ezekiel and be like, well, I can't see this angel that has so many wings and so
Right.
many eyes and so many faces. And
But the way I approach it is, if Christ is the Son of God and Christ resurrected, and the Gospels or the New Testament has shown itself to be pretty reliable. I don't think we have, unless we're presupposing naturalism or some type of bias to miracles or things of that nature, I don't see a reason to not accept it, because if he is supernatural, if it is supernatural, and these claims happened and they haven't been shown to be false, well, then the burden's on those who are trying to say it's false. I mean, there's no reason to, immediately go to skepticism,
right.
and
And
then
that's Swinburne's principle of credulity, where
right,
if a person it doesn't seem either way that they have a reason to corrupt what was actually said, or they're lying, and they're just saying something. You don't have any reason to deny that. You just say it's like 50-50. You don't have to. And if you know that person, then you have more reason to trust them. But
right.
uh, you don't have to like just be like, well, there's nothing Jesus seminar, and like, there's there's only a few sayings that we can actually hold to be even probable, or things like that. So
Yeah, it's I think too many people tend to be, too skeptical. There's like I don't know if you're familiar with Liz Jackson, and she was talking about the with skepticism that philosophers are typically global skeptics, but most atheists are local skeptics. They're not global skeptics. They only apply skepticism to a God claim. And traditionally, the philosophers, David Hume, and they were, global skeptics. They were skeptical about everything, and it becomes hard to justify and rationalize being a skeptic to just a God claim. It's, if you're going to be a skeptic, it needs to be something that's applied across the board, in order for it to be more defensible and more tenable. So I always get the question something like, well, there's a book and there's a man and he could fly. Okay, well, what's the book? Who's the man? What's the background knowledge?
yeah,
I'm not going to just dismiss everything outright, because I kind of take more of like a probability approach.
mm,
It's probably, I mean, it's not very probable that there was a man flying. But if you start adding background knowledge that would support that, well, then that changes, the probability of it. And I think we should evaluate other claims, you know, like if someone talks about reformed epistemology, well, then someone else of another religion can have warrant for their, okay, that
yeah,
doesn't deny the warrant that, Christians have, so yeah, there's a lot to it, and a lot of people like to,
be overly skeptical. And
yeah,
and that's why I like the term skepticism in some contexts, but it's, in common colloquial, like, it's, you can use that word. But when you're getting into technical language, being a skeptic is being very different than being critical, and if you're being critical, you're trying to develop an argument. And this is something that I see constantly, and this is actually something I see, a problem with a lot of apologists that I see, trying to interact with other people, where they just take this road of, let me try to undercut this person's opinion. and just constantly undercut. Okay, you can do that, but why don't you try to override their opinion for once? Why don't you try to build something and say this has rigorous methodology, and therefore I feel like my method's more tight, and my data's and I have higher quality data. Why don't you say something like that? It's much harder to be, it's way easy to be a critic. It's much easier to be a critic than to actually take the time to develop your case and go through the hard work of actually trudging through. And I actually kind of find it, pretty funny, because it's like people get into philosophy and they, first of all, don't understand how much technical terminology there is everywhere that completely changes the entire perspective. But second, they just see, oh, there's all these problems with Bayesianism. Oh, there's all these problems with abduction. Oh, there's all these problems with, induction. There's all these problems everywhere with all these things. We can't use any of those things, and therefore my position's right. And I'm like, okay, just because there's a problem doesn't mean like you can't use those tools. And in fact, you have to use those tools in daily living. And you being like somebody who has an HVAC background, come on, like,
Yeah.
can you imagine going to a client and then like, they're like, hey, this is not, this isn't working, and XYZ happened. And you're like, well, really? Did it happen? And, like, come on now. Are you kidding me? No, you're going to take like some abductive approach. You're going to be like, what's the best explanation? You're going to use Mill's methods. You're going to be like, okay, let me see if this works. Oh, that doesn't work. Well, that's connected to this, and maybe I'll check to see if this works. You'll do something like that. You won't like just constantly be like driving this person nuts, saying like, you don't know you don't even know if I exist. You don't do that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you said that, because I was just on a YouTube stream last night, and we were talking about the very same thing. And it's, when I have those conversations, and it goes to this skepticism about our ways of reasoning and things of that nature, I'm like, but wait a minute. We do this every day in our life. Every day in our life, we use inductive reason, abductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. This is how we live, and I think you made a very good point there. And that's um, having a critical analysis and developing a strong standpoint to come from, a good argument, a rigorous argument. And I think that's where apologetics kind of it's been like a double-edged sword, because now there is so many pop level apologetics available. People go and they learn just the surface of it and how to, just repeat it. And like you said, there's very heavy philosophical weight behind a lot of the ideas that apologetics is built on, and I mean, I'm not saying that it's not something people should do, but I think that people should be a bit more involved and really try to understand a little better, the arguments that's going on, instead of just,
or at least have intellectual humility. I think that's the bigger point.
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Because and this is, I understand a person who's a owner of a business who spends 80 to 90 hours, keeping their business afloat, is not going to have time to research all of their, methodology and make sure it's tight and everything. So I totally understand that. But at the same time, they can't have so minimal of a knowledge and so, and think that they're just so great and then like be an a-hole basically. That one of the things that actually I'm accounting for in my so with Ratio Christi, we have an internal training that I'm developing, and it's called Defensor Christi, and so it means defensor, defender of Christ, and this is a program that we're making that's going to be transferable into Liberty and then other schools eventually. So one of the things is I'm requiring that everybody takes a class called Leadership and Intellectual Virtues, and it doesn't actually count for any course credit unless you're doing undergrad. It counts for it counts for undergrad credit, but most of the program is built to be credit for graduate level. And but I'm requiring that everybody takes that no matter what first, because I don't want to just send out a bunch of a-hole apologists, that just think they know so much, and then like just first of all make everybody else who has done a lot of hard work look like fools, and and that we're part of a group. But like I've just noticed I've seen two types of apologists: guys who can laugh at themselves, or guys who are a-holes, you know, and they think they know everything. And I'd prefer to cultivate the guys that can laugh at themselves. And so I'm requiring that. And you know, there's Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work in helping to understand, you know, like how to be intellectually humble and using your recognition of cognitive bias and things like that. And so we're incorporating some of that content in there. But I think one of the main things is just realizing how many cognitive biases that you have, and that's going to be a huge part of it. And then also understanding what are intellectual virtues. So what does it mean to be intellectually humble, intellectually open, you know, have intellectual courage, have, you know, all of these intellectual virtues of the mind that allow you to not only think better, but just be a better person as you continue on your intellectual journey. And you know, if a person is sincere, you're also more willing to listen to them, and they're a better communicator, and that's the role of the apologist anyway. You're supposed to be somebody who's able to deal with tough, lofty issues, but also mediate that and disseminate that to the laity. And how can you communicate if you think you're so above everybody? You have to be on their level for them to actually trust you and actually change minds and things like that. So, yeah, we're requiring that class for that reason.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's years ago I was that a-hole. So I learned a few things about philosophy and took off running and run into a couple of buzzsaws. It's like, wait a minute, I don't know as much as I thought I knew. But intellectual honesty and humility are two of the greatest things that you can have. You sometimes you just have to say, I don't know.
Right, and you
Yeah,
have to be open to change your mind as well. And
absolutely.
that's one of the things I've seen also with apologists that are. It's like even if they, you know, walk this tightrope of rhetoric, and they're able to say like, you know, I'm going to listen to you and blah blah blah, they're actually not willing to change their mind. And I'm like, that's not being actually godly. You're not willing to find the truth. Is that what you're saying? You're basically like, you know, undercutting this person from the get-go and just like deceiving them basically, just to have them change their mind. It's like, no, you to have true communication means to say I'm actually willing to change my mind as well, you know. So
Absolutely, and that's very important. And I've made it clear, many a times. If I the moral argument was one of my favorite. I still think it's a very strong argument, but so many people have heard so many, um, rebuts to it that you go in circles, and it's just, to me, it's not even worth the time of trying to defend it anymore most of the time. So I usually really don't even go with a moral argument, because if someone's, well versed in ethics and they have some type of, moral realism that's normative or something like that, well, then we're just combating two different worldviews, and I can say, well, you really don't have objective morality, but, they're usually that far into it. They're, well versed enough that we can go in circles, and I was like, so I think, to me, I think the contingency, the set of cosmological arguments, to me, are the most convincing to me. So that's those are the ones I like to kind of focus on. I like, Josh Rasmussen's contingency argument, and the Kalam. I mean, that's most atheists who've, been around philosophy of religion long enough, and once they really grasp, the Kalam, the fullness of it, and the implications of it, there's a lot of them that'll readily admit that it's a pretty good argument for a first cause, and so a lot of people like to leap to, well, that doesn't get you the Christian God. Well, that's not exactly what I'm trying to do at the moment, because you're an atheist, which means you don't believe in God, So
right.
now I do believe that the Bible actually describes the same God that's being shown through the Kalam. But I think it's a lot of work, a lot of filling out and supporting to show that. So I usually don't try to go, hey, but it is the Christian God because of this, this, and this.
Mhm.
I'll typically, go to the resurrection or something like
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah, and I mean, that's debated within Christendom as well, with people who are a lot more, have a lot more fideistic types of apologetic methods, and they don't want to admit any sort of natural theology because it's not giving you the whole of Christianity and things like that. And and I just find that, like, I'm just like, wow, how do you even go about like categorizing anything at a higher level at all? How do you generalize anything whatsoever? And it's actually very, this is one of the areas where I think it's really interesting that people should take a little bit more time to study in, because this is a principle that crosses between disciplines. Looking at something at like, so I've also studied under Dr. Baggett, David Baggett, who has worked on the moral argument, the abductive moral argument a lot. And he would disagree with you on the impacts and
yeah,
the force of it.
yeah,
But I like a posteriori arguments way more than a priori, and I see the moral argument as something that is fits more into. I mean, it's in the middle ground, but it's more a priori, and existentially, I think it could be. You can make a great case, just like your daily living. How can you ignore ethical principles and ethical realism that's grounded in something like divine commands and or something like that? But the bigger point is, he would talk about something as being fine grained versus being coarse grained. And when you're talking about generic theism, like just a sort of like maximally great being or something like that, like an Anselmian God or something, you're talking about, you're saying that you have a coarse grained understanding right now, and then we can get into the finer grained details, and then maybe that works itself out to be Jesus as the Son of God, and you have a lot more content there. But it's so interesting to me where, like, when people start talking about things on a high level, they lose sight of this, and I think it's a very important distinction. Something's being fine grained or coarse grained, and this is in ethics as well. When you're talking about thin concepts versus thick concepts, so a thin concept would be like it would be like goodness, simpliciter, like something, Moore's argument for goodness being non-natural, something like that. So just goodness implicit, that's a very thin moral concept. And then you have like very thick moral concepts such as honesty or something like that. And to have like and to not understand those levels of explanation, really you lose sight of a lot of where a person can talk past each other really quickly. This happens also in psychology. They talk about something being high resolution. You're looking at something very high resolution. You're looking at all the details, all the pixels. Like you can see the football game. You can see that ball flying through the air, every blade of grass. And then you have low resolution. You could just see it from afar. You're seeing the whole stadium, all the crowd and everything.
all right.
Uh, and to argue and say, and you're talking, one person's talking about what's happening from the stadium from the aerial point of view, and another person's talking about like the blade of grass. You're clearly going to be talking past each other. So
Yeah,
I think that's a really important distinction to make, that I don't really, I see a lot of miscommunication
yeah.
happening with that.
For the record, I do think that the moral argument is very strong. I just don't,
Yeah.
and to me, it's something that's better done at the academic level,
Yeah.
because yeah, it's you like with the pop apologists, we have the pop atheists too, who follow Sam Harris, and these different moral realists from secular perspective and things. And I just, to me, too many times we end up just going round and round.
Right. Rhetorically, it's
Yeah,
not.
so it's kind of one of just the ones that I avoid now. Um, at the academic level, I would agree completely. I think it's an extremely powerful argument because I mean, it's so intuitive. It's if you don't have a way to um, really have objective morals, If you don't have a source, then they really aren't objective. And that's kind of the thing that gets me with, a lot of these normative and, irreducible. It's like we're just stopping with like brute facts. It's like I, I don't like
Yeah.
brute facts. I don't like just stopping right there. That's why I chose the name of this, because I've heard it so many times, in these conversations. It just, like Craig says, it's a lot of times it's like taxi cab fallacy, which really isn't a fallacy, but it's,
Yeah.
it's like they get right to that point and they're like, no, this is good. It's a brute
Yeah.
fact. Yeah. It's like, so, but no,
Yeah.
we both have a lot of very smart, sharp atheist friends. And
Oh yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and I mean, this is actually a very interesting distinction too that I want to point out that I see Thomists make, I see presuppositionalists make, I see normative realists make, and it's the idea that because something is more primitive conceptually, and you've broken down the sentence into words and the words into symbols, so you're just representing the most minimal atomic pieces of the sentence, and so you have like a copuli or something like that. You you know they, they say that the more primitive it is, the more certain we are of something, and I don't see that at all. I don't see that in reality at all. Just because something is more primitive in your head means it corresponds to reality? No, that's actually never, like, actually it's the opposite. The more you generalize things to be closer to first principles and more primitive, the less likely it is to be true, and the more you have to test for it to be true. And so the more, and you see this, just look at any study at all whatsoever. You can't just say that I've done this study on 20 people and I've got this result, and let me generalize it to 5 million people. Like it's less likely to be true at the 5 million level. So why do you think it's more likely to be true at a more primitive conceptual level? You're just generalizing more, and that makes it less probable. But this is something I've seen, like I said, with Thomists, with presuppositionalists, and with normative realists. It's a very interesting
yeah,
phenomenon.
that
So,
that's a
and
very good point.
I think it's because you use a priori reasoning, you have a priori beliefs, and you start with these things like such as causation, which seem to be synthetic a priori, truths like geometry and stuff like that. But then I just go back and say, hey, geometry, people can formulate they can take any set of postulates, create any theorem, and develop any sort of geometry of any figure, and it might not correspond to the world whatsoever. In fact, you have way more possibilities that it won't correspond to the world. And so why do you think that this, because it's more conceptually primitive, and it's certain based on its internal consistency and coherency, that it's more likely? I don't see that to be the case at all. So
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you're actually right. I've seen quite a few um, on both sides do the very same thing. So yeah, it's when we get to it's like I was talking on the stream last night. When a lot of people don't realize that the apologetics stem from the philosophy of religion, and same thing with a lot of the counter apologetics, is they stem from philosophy of religion, and people throw so many terms around, and
yeah.
it's and I'm just like, can you just say yes or no? I'm like, wait a minute, hold on now. You got to understand that the people that I talk to for years, you don't just say yes or no. You got to be very careful with your words and very precise. Because if you're not, you're going to talk past each other, or you're going to come off as not knowing what you're talking about. And you probably don't know what you're talking about. Using the word, when I hear someone say, how do you justify that? And I'm like,
You're like, hold on, what do
yeah,
you mean by justification?
yeah. What do you mean by justify? And I was explaining Reformed epistemology last night too, and they couldn't get past the weaker warranted claim. But that, I don't know how you can it's not justified. That's the whole point. Is it's a weaker. You still have an epistemic duty. You and if you have any defeaters, then you should abandon it, And I I for a long time I called myself Reformed epistemologist. I'm kind of leaning more towards the evidentialist now. Tim McGrew and Trent Doherty, and after listening to quite a few of their stuff, and I'm kind of torn now between internalists, externalists, and I'm just like, I don't know what I am. I don't know. So, I mean, I love Plantinga. I love what he developed. And given, if there is a sense of divine, as Calvin said, then you can know or be, warranted in believing that
Right.
there's a God.
You can at least be prima facie justified.
Right,
And
exactly.
just like any sort of seeming that you have about like anything you see. Oh, you thought you saw a car pass by and you can't go to check it. Hey, maybe a car passed by. Like whatever. That's fine. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more. It's much more
Right.
significant when you're dealing with what's the consequences and
Well,
everything.
that's kind of one of the things that, somebody was like, well, wait a minute. And as I'm explaining, I'm like, now hold on a second. Let me planning to develop this over like 20 years, I think it was. And it's like was a 5 or 7 volume set that he released. So I'm like, there's a lot of support there. I'm not going to do it justice. You need to see, Dr. Tyler McNabb or Dr. Moon or, Plantinga himself,
Yeah.
because there really is a lot to it. It's a lot more than what it seems like, because it to a lot of people, it seems too simple to.
I would, because I'm much more, like I said, a posteriori person, objective probability type of thing. So I'm definitely with Trent on that. Um, I would recommend Justin Barrett. He's a cognitive scientist, and he's done a lot of work in developmental psychology, and he's actually a person that Plantinga would look to for more information, because he showed that children naturally have this. He wrote a book called I think it was called Born Believers, and he went through all the literature, the internationally cross-cultural literature on child development, showing that kids naturally tend to see an immaterial agent, that has causal impact on the world, and these agents, and maybe one grand agent is super knowing, super perceiving, extremely intelligent, and a moral enforcer, things like that. He actually came up with a lot of very interesting findings, and like I said, you're dealing in the realm of developmental psychology here. So this is on the borderline between a priori and a posteriori. So that's still something you still have to investigate, and then like on the practical level, does this seem to make sense? You have to decide that. But I highly recommend checking out that. And
Yeah, I'm
Justin,
not familiar with them. I definitely will, because I'm interested myself in the psychology of beliefs. Period. That's kind of the direction I'm starting to go now, because I'm just stunned at how two people with similar backgrounds and similar skepticism and similar analytic way of thinking can look at a set of facts and just come to two totally different conclusions. I'm just like, how is that possible? So,
right, right.
and it was Barrett was his name.
Yeah, Justin Barrett, and it's Barrett. So two R's, two T's.
Okay, all right, yeah, definitely. I'm definitely interested in that one. I'll check that one out. So, do you guys have over at Ratio Christi? So, who else a part of? It's a pretty big organization, isn't it?
Yeah, it's international. I mean, like if you want to, but it's mostly in the U.S. But yeah, so Corey Miller's the president, and then we have Larry Baxter as the CFO, and we have a lot of different. I mean, it's a national organization, and then we're split, and we each have area ministry directors that go oversee states, and then chapter directors underneath them. So it's with COVID and things like that, it's kind of like cut back a little bit, because you can't really meet on campus as much anymore, and there's so much more legislation and stuff that's like everybody has to be particular, and everybody is trying to be safe about it, and like still promote the sanctity of life and things like that.
Right.
But it's still like we've still been meeting on Zoom and things, and it's been great. I've really enjoyed working with Ratio Christi, and I see the potential for it to develop, quantitatively and qualitatively, a lot in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So are they going to have any online stuff, or is it strictly for in person, or how does?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're doing a lot more online now, and we probably are going to extend that to indefinitely in the future. And there's been some chapter directors that have been putting together symposia and have had like amazing speakers all come together and do it that way. Um, Obviously, we're way more interpersonal, and the whole reason that we're doing it, we have the type of model that we have is because we think you can reach a person much better in person,
Yeah,
and there's a lot more relational cues that you're aware of going on in person rather than online. But I think now we're gonna make room for online, certainly with like the program that I'm working on and others. So
that's cool, man. It's we definitely need some more training programs. We need to get people trained up and warriors.
yeah, warriors for Christ.
Yeah. It's bring out the militants. Yeah,
Yeah, let's make everybody extremely presuppositional and Calvinist, and
there we go. Yeah. Oh, precept. Oh, my brothers in precept. Oh man, that's kind of where I started out. I just fell into it. I didn't know what I was doing, this, that, or the other. But it was two guys I was listening to on a podcast, and I don't remember their names, but they were pretty much just Van Tillian. They weren't like Greg Bonson or
Mhm.
it slides downhill to side 10, and then I hate to talk about my brothers in Christ, but man,
Right.
it's some of them are they just watching the conversations. I'm like, okay, look, we all have to use logic.
Right. We all start with we all and we d- I,
Let's advance the conversation, please.
that's where I'm saying that's an example of like just undercut, undercut, undercut,
Yeah.
undercut, undercut. It's like, are you building anything? No, you're just starting with all of it. You think you could just start in paradise. It doesn't work that way. No, we all have to work through like looking through our eyes and believing that the external world is like, you don't just start with all of Christendom and understanding of the entire inerrant Bible behind you. Like that nobody does that.
Yeah, it's it's there's so when I stumbled upon this atheist group that I've been doing a lot with over at the Atheist Roundtable, and they're real cool guys. I found this several apologists out there I had no idea existed. And these are like people that worship Kent Hovind, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Kent Hovind. Uh,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I haven't looked a ton, but I've seen enough. Yeah.
yeah, and one of them I think it's Batman or something like that, Darth Dawkins, and they're just this horrible precepts, man. And it's like I'm just like my ears are just bleeding, and I'm like in the debates I'm like pulling for the atheist. I'm like, come on, guys,
Right.
because you can't even start to fight my position unless you justify where you get, and I'm just like, man, just
That's actually very interesting, because the Ratio Christi has actually worked with Dr. Boghossian, the street epistemology guy,
yeah,
a lot
Peter, yeah,
recently, because we have common enemies of like postmodern, literary theory and stuff like that, developing into like general hermeneutics and stuff. And so we have common enemies. And I actually something that I felt like I always knew, and but I just didn't see other Christians grasping, is that we're always unlikely bedfellows with every belief system when it comes to other belief systems. That's just the nature of belief systems. And so a great example of this was there was a bunch of street epistemologists who were going to go down to North Carolina to a flat earth conference and like do their whole street epistemology thing. And a bunch of Christians were like, hey, can we join you guys? Like, can we talk to, and they were debating, like Christians, flat earther Christians with street epistemologists on their side, And I was just like, this is like one of the greatest things I've ever heard. Like,
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because that's kind of how I ended up over with the atheist roundtable stuff. It's the fundamentalists, like the real strong fundamentalists, are we have a common enemy, and it's
right,
not the people, it's the
I,
mindset, it's
yeah,
the
yeah,
dogma, it's the so that's how we hit it off. Now, it's funny you mentioned street epistemology because my only exposure to it was the original street epistemology to, basically make atheists and, deconvert and things of that nature. Um, but these guys, it's just so when I first went on the show, I was like, wait a minute, man, y'all do this whole street epistemology thing. I can't justify my beliefs or anything else without, showing the problem with street epistemology, which there's a whole lot of them, and, um, but the way that they do it is not like a deconversion tool. They use it like the Socratic method.
right,
And once they get somebody to the point of thinking, then they stop. They're not there to, take all this stuff. And so I really admire the way that they use it. And, and I told them that. I was like, look, this is the first time I've seen anybody use street epistemology like that. And it's a real helpful tool if it's done right.
right. And I think I mean, that's just the natural way of doing philosophy. The way that Aristotle viewed it as an activity, and it's just, are you, questioning things, and how can you evoke wonder in a person to think more deeply about something and have a broader perspective and stuff like that. And I think they had some growing problems when they first came out, just like any idea, set of ideas does. But I think after it's grown into what it is now, I think it's much more of like, are you critically thinking? And I'm glad they're asking that question to people. Are you critically thinking? Ask that to every Christian. Are you critically thinking? That will eventually, if you think that what you have is truth, that will make a person more confident.
Yeah.
So why not celebrate that?
Yeah. And well, I mean, and to be fair to Peter, I mean, Peter's changed a lot since he wrote that book too. He's,
Right. Yeah.
he's doesn't view it as a deconversion kind of thing. And from what I understand, his next book was actually a pretty good book about tough conversations or
Mhm.
things. And but that's cool. I didn't. I saw that you had mentioned in the group that you guys work with Peter, and that's pretty cool because I hadn't heard that name in so long. And when you mentioned it, or when I was talking about the street epistemology, and he's like, "Yeah, he works with us sometimes." I was like, "What? Peter,
Yeah.
Peter Boghossian? No way! The
Yeah.
atheist manual guy?
I,
Come on!"
Yeah, I mean it's the same with John Loftus. Like I would have never,
Yeah,
like when I saw his stuff on Barnes and Noble, I was like, "Who's this guy? You're ridiculous. I hate this guy." And then like after I got to talking to him and stuff, like he's a great guy, and he's a polemicist. Like I told him like, "Dude, you sound like Nietzsche." Like, and I wasn't trying to that wasn't a compliment or like or pejorative. I was just like, "You just sound like Nietzsche," and he's like, "Thank you so much." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that makes so much more sense now."
yeah. I don't know too much about Loftus, but I've heard a lot of not nice things about Loftus. Um,
You have to show him respect, and like it's like you get what you give, sort of thing. And
yeah.
he'll automatically, like give you crap, and if you can take it well, it's kind of like I played basketball for 15 years, and it's
Oh, it's on now, David. That's my sport, man.
no way, that's awesome.
Yeah,
But you know how it is. It's like you get on the court and you're with your group of guys, and then you see another group, and you're like, let's mess. Like, obviously, I'm not gonna say everything that we used to say, but let's f these guys up, and then like you get really into it. You get close to getting in fights, and then after it's all done, like you high five, you hug each other, and everything, sweating, like shirt off and everything,
yeah.
gross, and then you love the guy after. But if you don't make that move at the end, you're not going to be cool with them for the rest of the time you ever see them. And but if you do make that move, you guys are going to be buds every time you see each other. And I think it's like that with Loftus and other people like that.
Yeah, yeah, it did give due respect, man. It's we might butt heads, but at the end of the day, we had the same goals. It's most of us, for the most part, want to find truth.
Right, exactly.
And it's
Yeah.
funny you're talking about with the basketball because we, being from Memphis, you can't be a Memphian if you don't play ball. That's kind of like your rite of passage. So, but we played from the time I was about 10 or 11 until mid 20 street ball every afternoon, every weekend. We had a local park that we'd go to, and the benches would be lined with people for people to have downs. And what's weird is the older I've got, the more of a germ freak I've turned into. So I'm thinking back of the days that we were all sweaty, guarding each other, no shirts on, arms on them, hand checking, all of this. And I'm just like, ew. just
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I know. And I didn't care back then too. And I wouldn't even. There'd be some days I'd be like, I guess I don't need a shower. And I'm like, man, that was disgusting. Like back, but I mean, and I would get some bit like I would always play center. I mean, I wasn't super duper tall. I'm like 6'1", 6'2", and but I was super thin back then. But I had hops, and so I could get up, and because of that, I'd always play center, and I'd have the biggest guys on me, dude. Like I'd have like 300-pound guy just shirtless, just coming down all up on me, and
yeah,
I didn't care at the time. I mean, like, other than the smelling part, but
I even did jujitsu for a while,
Oh,
and
wow, you're rolling, man.
and yeah, and I was just like, this is gross. This is nasty. We're like stinking and sweating all over each other. And it just,
Yeah.
oh, I remember the first time I rolled with a guy who was wearing a cup. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
it was the oddest, weirdest thing in my life. I'm
oh,
like, bro, why are you rolling with a cup, man? That's like when you are like, when he mounted me and I just got this thing in my chest like this, I'm like, get off me. It was, let me tell you something. When something like that's weird, you get them off of you pretty quick.
yeah, dude, I'll tap. Like, I'm done.
Do you know how I got into jujitsu? I had a friend of mine who I did a little bit of boxing when I was young, and so with my friends who weren't good fighters or big fighters, it's like, oh no, he's a boxer, he's a boxer. It's like, no, I wasn't a boxer. I did some training and stuff, and so he's like, man, yeah, you need with your boxing, come on up here, and I'm just like, whatever. Mid-20s, I was like, I need to get back in shape, so I went up there and I rolled with this 17-year-old kid who tapped me out in about 15 seconds,
Dang.
and I was like, bro, this is what I want to learn. Yeah, this is right here. Put me in an arm bar before I even knew what he was doing. He had
Yeah.
me in an arm bar, and I was like, okay, I need that arm. So I fell in love with it. But
That's awesome.
rolling with them young guys, they only know 100%, and I kept getting injured, and I had a career, and I was like, man, I just can't keep doing it.
Yeah.
Y'all are hurting me. I can't do it. So. Yeah, it's so Tim Stratton plays ball. Um, oh, how did I forget his name? ID Apologetics.
Mike.
Adam Coleman.
Oh,
Adam Coleman plays.
True ID. Gotcha.
Adam Coleman plays ball. You play ball. I play ball. What's up?
Hey, Adam is only like a few hours from me. I think he's like
Really?
2.5 hours. Yeah.
Oh wow! Yeah, he was. He was my first show ever. I was stoked that he was like, yeah, man, absolutely. I was like, sweet. Somebody who has a following is going to come on for the first show. So.
Did you see that he's contributing to that new book?
Yeah,
yeah, that's pretty amazing.
And he's going back to get his doctorate too.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. What's the doctorate in?
He said on the show,
he's a master's in social work, I think.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, after Tim getting his doctorate, and just all the people in the group that have degrees, I'm sitting here like, I don't have anything. It's yeah. So I actually registered to start a bachelor's in
Oh,
mechanical engineering, and
yeah, I saw that. That's awesome, man. Congratulations.
yeah,
That's super cool. And I
yeah,
think it's so cool how like they've put a lot of those classes online for people to do. It's
yes.
super cool. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't do it with my work schedule. There's no way I could do it without it all being online. And I was like, man, I don't have an excuse now. You know,
Yeah.
and if I pursued philosophy, I'd be broke. So I'm gonna.
Yeah. I like get a bachelor's that'll give you a career and then
That's
get a master's maybe for fun and then get a PhD if you want to teach or something.
well, that's exactly what I said I'm going to do. I'm going to get the mechanical engineering bachelor's because I mean I work on data center power equipment. My background's HVAC. I have a real good knowledge of fluid dynamics, electrical things of that nature. So I was like, it's just natural. I love math. I love science. So uh, I'm gonna go that route and then hopefully get a master's, switch over and get a master's in philosophy. And
Analytic from
yeah,
that math background. Yeah.
yes, and maybe when I'm 60, I'll get a PhD. I don't know.
Hey, maybe I dude, I like so I used to work for Liberty University Online and I'd be in consulting and I would talk to people who were interested in, pursuing degrees and stuff. There was a lady that there within 1 week I talked to one lady who she was born in 1928 and she wanted to get her master's and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing.
Wow.
And then just less than a week later, I talked to this guy who was born in 1926, who was trying to get his bachelor's, and
Wow.
and he said he just wanted to do it for his grandkids to show that it's possible and everything. And
That's awesome, man.
yeah, and I was like, man, I respect you guys so much. That's so cool.
It's
And it's for itself. It's not for anything else after they see the value in it just for itself. And I mean I think there's instrumental value to it as well, of course. That's the reason why I'm pursuing a PhD. I don't think you really need it like unless you're going to teach. You PhDs come a dime a dozen now. Like there's so many millions of PhDs
yeah,
in the U.S. Or doctorates at least in the U.S. that it's not really unless you're really trying to get into the area of study or something like that, or you want to teach. Like it's not a career. It's not a
right.
career degree usually. So
Yeah, that's well, all the professors are tenured. It's
right.
not positions that come open very often. Um, so yeah, I want to do it. As just a better more knowledge myself. I mean, it's my wife is finishing her bachelor's in education. I think she switched over to administration. I'm not sure, but it's in education. She is a phenomenal writer, phenomenal. And so I was like, man, if I could, get a little bit of formal, a little more formal. I don't have a degree, but trade school. I kind of covered a lot of bases there, but it's and have her write for me. It's
Hey, that's how I mean, so David Baggett, he's a great writer himself, but then his wife is also like she's also a professor of English literature. And dude, when they write together, like they wrote this book called The Moral of the Story, and it was just like so good. They can write, like he has ideas, he has all the philosophy background and he can write pretty well, and then she edits like crazy and it just turns into like this masterpiece. So I mean, you can get that going, man.
yeah, it's awesome. It's a talent she's had for a long time and hasn't showcased. And I'm like, man, you have got to write something. You have got to, because it's when we do things ourselves and people tell us we're good at it. We don't realize it's sometimes that some people are just really good at it. And that's what I'm trying to tell them. Like you're not just above average. You are phenomenal. You should be writing something. So
Yeah.
and she started taking a lot more creative writing classes and different things, and so hopefully one day she'll make us rich. And,
Well, I mean, if you're interested in ever publishing and in an academic journal. That was the other thing that I was going to bring up was, so I'm the managing editor for Eleutheria, which is it's the student journal of the School of Divinity, but it's peer reviewed, and we generally only accept graduate work, but it doesn't really matter. We have philosophers contributing to it, people who have
Oh
um,
wow.
so it's uh, and Dr. Habermas is going to be contributing for the next 2 volumes that we're coming out with. But if you want to contribute to that, that's an easy way to start
Absolutely.
taking up credentials, and especially if you're applying to a master's in philosophy or something like that.
Yeah, man, absolutely. That's I actually have something I'm working on now that I'm trying to develop a little bit. So it's more along the lines of the people always ask, why God created us the way that he did, so um and it's more along the lines of the question, could God create perfect moral beings with free will? And that's just kind of an area that, I've done a lot of reading in it, and I'm just not satisfied with, a lot of the reading that I have done. So it's something I want to kind of work on and develop a little
Yeah,
more, because it's a question I get a lot. Why did God make us the way he did? Why didn't he make us um, perfectly moral and happy? And usually just give the typical answers. I mean, given free will, you know, it may not have been feasible for God to create a
right,
world. I mean, he could create a world, but like that, but it may not be feasible given free will. And, the kind of the measuring stick, the privation, the what is good without bad? What is
right,
what are these things that we use as a measure? The worse it is, the greater the good is, and it kind of it's like a balance on it. So, yeah, that's something more of a, uh, I don't know if it would go into modal logic. I don't think it would be something that's modal, but it's, there's something a little more technical is what I'd
yeah.
like to work
I mean,
on.
there's been I can tell you work on deontic logic if you want more information on that.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and because it's an extension of modal logic, uh,
Right.
so you're dealing with a lot of the same axioms and the same axiom systems. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and that is a very interesting field of logics because it doesn't seem to. There's so many strange cases where it seems like we're missing something. Um, and things aren't as consistent as people would hope they would be. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of areas that are opportune for contribution.
Yeah, and it's funny, I was usually when I'm talking with people about, philosophy and stuff that's not familiar with it, and, and they're throwing these terms around and stuff like that. And I'm like, I want you to picture a windshield on a car that has been cracked. You have all these million cracks in there, right? Well, pick one crack, and that's what a philosopher will spend his entire career on because there's so many different ways. I mean, it's you start down this road and then you go down this road, and then you're down this road, and it's like, okay, wait a minute. I have to find something that I like the most and
Yeah.
focus on that because I was overwhelmed in the beginning because there's just so many topics and you can't know it all. You can't study it all. It's
And that's another good um, example of like what Aristotle called phronesis, where it's like you have to mesh the theoretical with the practical, and it has to be done with wisdom. And one of the areas that I've seen that applied to is when you're going through a field of study, and it's so critical, and there's so many technical terms and things like that, and it's so abstract, it's hard to follow. It's hard to follow such abstract concepts. And I think one of the wise things to do is pick a side. Just pick a side. It could just be provisionally. You don't have to commit to it completely, but just pick a side for the moment and then let it develop as you read more and more and be like, maybe this is wrong. Maybe I need to revise this. Maybe, just go through that whole belief revision process and accommodate for the new data whenever you come by it. But when I see a person trying to be completely unbiased while they're reading through something, I mean, that's the time when they'll never finish a book, you know, because it's like, it's hard to not, it's like I said, you don't have to commit to everything, you know, that one stance is saying. I'm just saying that that's one great way of going through the literature. You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's good. You know, and um Aristotle's one of those guys, man. You could there's so much you can learn. I have a far greater appreciation for Aristotle now than I ever did in the past, you know, because of just how far reaching his work is. You know? And I think about people now and, you know, with this chronological snobbery, they think that we're so much smarter than anybody in the past was. And I'm like, wait a minute. Do you know how many books have been written to interpret these guys? You know, because they were far beyond their time. It was,
Right.
there are some great minds in history, and we're talking thousands of years ago, you know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's,
The
yeah,
impact that they've had and like some of their ideas that have lasted until today, it's pretty incredible. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, how much do we talk about, you know, Aristotelian uh, physics or metaphysics? And, you know, it's just that we keep all of these principles, I mean, that underlie so much of the philosophical structures today. You know, Thomism, I mean, look at what Aquinas built off of, you know,
Right.
it was a lot of Aristotle and
Right.
Aquinas's work. So yeah, it's phenomenal, man. We have been blessed with some great minds throughout history. So, and we've got some great people, you know, carrying the torch now. It's
Yeah.
I I I wasn't familiar with philosophy of religion growing up. I'm not huge on the recent history up until now, but it seems to be the phenomenal boom in philosophy in general. You know,
Right.
the
After the downfall of logical
right,
positivism, I mean, this is the same case with axiology. It's actually the axiology is the study of values um, and there's various ways you can talk about it, but it was a branch of phenomenology, and that whole discipline kind of collapsed under logical positivism, and it was only gaining traction like late 1800s, and then you know like by the 1930s it was like laughed at. And
yeah,
but then after, you know, logical positivism has shown to, you know, have its limits, um, areas of study such as religious studies, which used to be thought of as like a subdiscipline within axiology, has just like boomed. And so things in the humanities and have boomed. And I mean, you know, for for better or for worse, but yeah, and philosophy was one of those things that used to be thought of as within the humanities, and because
yeah,
of it's starting to flourish again and in so many different ways. I think it's super cool.
yeah. It is, man. It's you know, if you would have asked me 20 years ago about philosophy, I'd be like, "What's philosophy? Why did you know a bunch of people sitting around asking questions?" You know, it just, I would have never thought in a million years I would have ended up in philosophy. And the first time I was ever faced with, you know, prove to me you exist. That's stupid. I exist. I mean, you're talking to me.
Yeah.
No, prove to me that you're not a brain in a vat. And, you know, and they're coming up with this crazy stuff. And then I was like, wait a minute. How do I know I'm not? You know, it kind of really hit me one day, and it scared the mess out of me. I was like, whoa, all these things that I took for granted, you know, and just assumed. I was like, I don't know that. I really don't know that, you know. So it kind of hooked me. It was like, I need to know more. I need to, how can I be comfortable in the fact that I exist, that I'm not a brain in a vat, you
Yeah.
know. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's truly like it's something that can always bring you more humility as you like try to discover how little you know and things like that. Um, I mean, I also find that like there's some areas of philosophy that are just like, okay, this is so impractical. Like let's just like I mean, but there's certain, and you have to dig so deep to find the significance that has like pervasive significance. So, like trying to answer the liar's paradox, for example,
Oh,
and then trying to get into, like why is that? Why is that wrong? And it has significant consequences, and you get into metalinguistics, and stuff like that, and you're like, wow, okay, this has very significant consequences for our theories of truth and all of that. But you have to dig so deep for some things, and some of them are just so insignificant that I'm like, why are people spending so
that's
much time on these things? But yeah, but then I realize, hey, I mean, like they're saying the same thing about what I'm studying, probably, and so I have to trust that, like what they're doing is actually beneficial in some way.
yeah. There's some fruit that's going to come from it.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, there's a guy in the chat. His name is Mark, and I'm on Discord, and we went round and round one night about the liar's paradox, and it was just like a week ago. So, and I mean, we must have spent 2 hours, talking about the liar's paradox, and he's like, "Well, I think he's Canadian, so it's like, well, I think there's something there," and I'm like, "No, it's just." There's no content there, It's when you say that the contradiction, there's just nothing there. I mean, it's irrationality. And he's like, oh, wait a minute now. It's so he's
Yeah.
uh he's a cool guy. He's
That's great. I
just
mean, yeah, that's something I had to wrestle with for a while too, and I was like, and I actually pushed it aside because I was like, okay, this is inconsequential. And then I got to like theories of truth, and then I was like, okay, I think I have to revisit this now again. and
yeah,
and because you're talking about philosophical logic at that point, and you're like, okay, why is something symbolized, and how does it have a referent that goes beyond the theory? How is this meta theoretical? And can you symbolize the meta theory? Because all of a sudden now you're outside of the theory. So how can you symbolize it? And questions like that, that you're finally getting to, I think has implications for how do you determine whether something's real, like the realism anti-realism debate in
right.
philosophy of science and stuff like that. And so I found like great significance in things like that. But yeah, it's one of those things that you only come across later in life, and you're like, okay, wait, maybe that did have some significance.
I have avoided semantics and linguistics on purpose. It is just, it's if there was ever rabbit holes, it just it's
I mean, I think
it's
you'll be
valuable. It's very valuable, but it's like math to my wife. I mean,
right. Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. It's a very abstract sort of thing,
yeah,
and if you get into analytic philosophy, you have to go through Wittgenstein and the language games, and you have to go through all of that. But I think you'll have an intuitive like bent towards it once you start to understand the overarching concepts that are just written in plain English,
yeah.
and and then you discover like, oh, this is why they symbolize it this way or that way. I think you'll have a very quick understanding of it if you have a math background. So
Okay, well, that's good to know because I have tried to avoid it a lot because sometimes when you do talk with someone who's very astute in linguistics and semantics specifically, it's kind of like we are when we talk about certain topics. The words we use carry a lot of weight, and
mhm.
if both parties aren't privy to that information, then you end up kind of talking past each other,
Oh
and
yeah, of course, very easily, and a lot of those things don't have very, like I said, it has very minimal significance unless you understand the very specific context you're talking about. So
right, yeah. Defining terms, that is the number one thing. To this day, I still run into myself talking to people, and I'm like, wait a minute. Let's step back. How are you using this word? What do you mean by this word?
that's also a very practical way that I've seen philosophy influence conversation and stuff like that. Where, and I don't say it out loud, but I do it in my head, and I'm like, okay, there seems to be something awry here, and there seems to be some conflation. So how do I map this out? First of all, like, where are these concepts within philosophy in general? Is it under metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and then within there, where like how is this like mapping down to the level of explanation that I can actually wrap my head around it, and then from there I can tease out some distinctions that make like the conflation go away, and I've seen that like whenever I do that in my head and I'm talking to somebody, and I realize that's going on, it's much easier to go through that conversation and be like, hey, this kind of makes sense if you think about it in this context, actually, or use analogies and stuff like that at that point. But I mean, like that's one reason why I would recommend philosophy as a way of developing critical thinking to other people, because it just helps you give language to like the theoretical gray area that you kind of are just lost in if you don't have those terms to navigate by. So
Yeah, and I'm still stunned that not all high schools, force a critical thinking class
yeah.
or I can't believe we're at this point where, as much influence as philosophy has had, that we still don't have mandatory critical thinking classes. And I'm just like,
I know, and it's interesting because like gen ed curricula, like a lot of them have been switched to say you can, instead of taking this critical thinking class like logic or something, no, now you can just take like music or something, or literature, which can be critical thinking, but it's like it can also be very not critical if the professor wants it to be. And like those ways in which like the quality just goes down, I'm just like, that's just too bad.
well, it's funny because I was just looking at the list of classes, that I'm starting with, and I saw that there was music, arts appreciation, something else, and logic. And I'm like, okay, I'm taking logic.
Yeah.
I'm like, why is logic thrown in there with these other ones? Shouldn't that be like a mandatory courses?
Right.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's yeah. I mean, we force people to have math. Why can't we force people to have math with words? Because that's what logic is.
Yeah.
It's a way to quantify and to have deduction. I mean, it's or induction. It's like it is so important. I just maybe that'll be our the next generation's their push will be.
Hopefully. We want logic class.
That's right. Hashtag critical thinking.
Yeah.
Let's start
Yeah.
it in junior high.
Yeah. I don't know. Who knows what's gonna happen in the next
Yeah.
10, 20 years? But
Uh,
I mean, like math too. I mean, logic, math, business. There's a lot of things that can be super boring if you don't apply it to anything. I think that's what's missing with people. I mean, you see this with with cognitive biases and heuristics. People can do stuff like with you doing HVAC stuff. Like it's like you do the thing first with your hands, and then you can kind of go back and be like, oh, that theory was super easy to navigate because I could just imagine myself doing it, and then
right.
comparing, like abstracting that memory and then that imagination into like conceptual fragments. It's like that's the way people usually learn. They don't start with those conceptual components and then develop it into something that can be worked practically. They do that in reverse. So
Right. Yeah. The hands on,
right, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, that's what I love about the trade school that I did go to, because what makes me mad is I went enough hours to get an associate's degree, but I didn't get an associate's degree. But we spent, we would spend equal time, lecture and lab, and it was, uh, lab oriented, because that's how a lot of people learn, you know. I mean, for the most part, I'd say at least, analytic people,
Mhm.
who are real analytical tend to, they need to be out there. They need to see it, work it, and then put it all together. So
Yeah, I was gonna say, and maybe this is something we can talk about after the show, but like if you've got certifications and things like that, a lot of those schools have made it so that you can transfer a lot of those for course credits. Not as much as they should be worth, obviously, for how much
yeah,
you've done, but something, it's worth it, and it drives the cost down in time. So
yeah, and I'm looking for as few classes as possible. I am studying like crazy now, so when I do the placement exam, I just hit right on course and go. So it's
yeah.
because I do. I mean, I'm not obviously not a math wizard or anything, but I have a pretty good understanding. Algebra. I didn't take a whole lot of advanced math, but if I can just get past the pre or requisite prerequisites, then I'm happy. It's I want to take as few classes as possible.
Yeah.
Get done as soon as possible. Time is ticking. So
Right. I totally understand that.
absolutely. Oh man, it is man, we are already an hour and a half into it.
I know.
Is
Went
there
by so
anything
quick.
else you wanted to cover before we cut it off, or
Maybe another time. But yeah.
I'm tired. It's time to go to you. Are you East Coast?
Yeah, East Coast,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's right. You said Virginia. Oh yeah, it's your bedtime, man. So,
It's 2 hours past. I'm an old man here.
oh, I feel you. Yeah, get out of here, man. I appreciate you coming on, David. Man, I learned a lot. I have fantastic resources. I'm gonna run this back and um, you know, listen to it again. I usually listen to them a couple of times and take notes afterwards. So I'm terrible about keeping my attention and taking notes. So I go back and do.
Yeah.
So, man, I appreciate all the work you guys are doing too. We need boots on the ground, people out there and just to reaching out, man. It's fantastic, so, and I'd definitely like to have you on again, maybe in the future or something. So,
Sounds good.
yeah, I appreciate you coming on, bud.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate
All
it.
right. This thing is froze up on me, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get my outro going or not because all those dings you kept hearing was me. The screen doesn't want to work for me, so you can disconnect if you want.
Or I can sing a song and pretend we're going out.
There we go. Yeah, kumbaya.
The Brookbacks podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, hey, where's Oz is not in the Oz is the one who told me to use StreamYard, and now StreamYard's not wanting to work. So we may just have an abrupt ending here.
Right, sounds good.
All right, bud. Have a good evening.
You as well. Take care.
All right, bye. Oh, StreamYard sucks. Thanks, Oz. I appreciate it, man. It's not going to stop. Oh, come on. It's late. Yeah, I hear you. You keep dinging on me, fool. I know what to do it. Task manager, baby. Every time. Where's it at? Let's go to Chrome. It's always something. Always. Thank you, everybody, for coming on and watching. I have the Atheist Troll next week. That is going to be fun. You do not want to miss that. I can guarantee it. I'm going to try to keep it PG, but with Jeff on, you never know what's going to happen. So, hey, it just went away. I had it, and it's gone. Well, we just hang out here all night. That's all right. It's not like I don't have anything better to do. Sit here and play with the computer that's froze up on me and making me look like an idiot. Any day now. Are you kidding me? It's not even on the list.